I'm going to give a short introduction. I'm sure Gautam Bhatia doesn't need one, but just for formality, Dr. Gautam Bhatia is a distinguished lawyer, professor, as well as a novelist of speculative fiction. He has been the recipient of prestigious fellowships such as Rhodes and earned degrees from acclaimed universities like University of Oxford and Yale Law School. Aside from numerous columns in print and digital media, he has authored multiple books on both constitutional law, like Offend, Shock, or Disturb, Freedom of Speech under the Indian Constitution, also written The Transformative Constitution, a radical biography, Nine Acts, as well as science fiction, like The Wall, The Horizon, The Sentence. Some of them are outside near the food stalls. If you're interested in buying, please do. Additionally, an essay by him is included in the syllabus for Understanding India. So welcome, Gautam. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm wearing my science fiction hat today, not the lawyer's hat, so you can ignore the first half of that bio entirely. So this topic, which is writing justice, visions of the future, how speculative fiction shapes our ideas of justice, society, and the future. So when I saw this topic, I thought that at least in the remarks that I make, what I would do is I would just take you through a history of the genre of science fiction or speculative fiction. Both terms are used quite interchangeably these days, and its long engagement through different eras with notions of justice, the future, and ideas of that kind, leading up to the present day. And then once I've done that historical tour, then in the Q&A we could talk a bit more perhaps about contemporary science fiction and the other kinds of intersections that the genre presently has with ideas of justice and the future. So to begin with, there is often a quite acrimonious debate between people who really care about this stuff, which is what was the first science fiction novel, or which novel inaugurated this genre of science fiction. And there is general, if not universal, agreement that it is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that was the first novel that you can recognizably call a science fiction novel, of course, 200 years ago now. And in that novel, you can see for the first time many of the preoccupations, anxieties, and worries that would go on to define this genre of writing for the next 200 years. You see, in particular, the fear of what technology can do when it is left uncontrolled, when it is in the hands of someone who doesn't really know what to do with it, and that fear of the stranger, of the other, of the culmination of technology is very much present in that novel. Keep in mind that this novel was written at a time when the Industrial Revolution had really taken off. And so there was this sense of a very rapidly changing world, much like today. This sense that the old ways are disappearing, the sense that old relationships are disintegrating, and there is a future that is both in some ways exciting, but also in some ways quite terrifying. And Frankenstein really is at the intersection of that tension between a future that could either be liberating and wonderful or be terrifying, but also have elements of both at the same time. And that's a lot of what goes on in that novel. So in those very early days, you see much of what came to define this style of writing over the next 2 centuries. In the 19th century, there were writers who really worked on and pushed the limits of the imagination using science fiction as a genre, and many of them were again dealing with ideas of the future. So one of the most famous early novels, The Time Machine, talks about the far future when humanity is split up into 2 branches of different kinds of descendants of human beings. The Eloi, who are innocent and are non-violent, who live above ground, and the Morlocks, who are extremely violent and reflect the darker tendencies and the conflict between the two of them. And so that's one example of novels that really used science fictional tropes like time travel, the far future, to reflect upon the human condition, to reflect upon the inner contradictions within human beings. And so that became, a site of exploration. But these novels were few and far between. Dominant form of writing, of course, at that time was realist fiction. And it is only around the 1930s that science fiction as a style, a genre of writing, really becomes, in certain ways, quite popular in terms of not just who reads it, but also who writes it. And interestingly, science fiction at that time starts its life as a pulp genre. So it's published in pulp magazines, available at very cheap prices, distributed widely, and which of course gives a certain countercultural aspect to it, a certain underground rebellious tendency that the genre has, something that is off the beaten track, something that is not quite the mainstream, and is dealing with questions, with issues, and with ideas that mainstream fiction would not touch or would not go near. So that is the image that certain writers put forward in that time, but also science fiction, like any other kind of fiction, is in many ways responding to society, and it is responding to many of the core and the key questions that society is confronting at that time. And so, in the dominant mode of science fiction at that time, you broadly see two tendencies. One is optimism about technology, optimism about the future. The idea that, which of course is still prevalent in many, in public discourse, the idea that technology will ultimately solve many of the existing economic and social problems. Once we have a sufficiently advanced level of technology, issues like labor, issues like inequality will be solved once robots end up doing the work that human beings do presently, and that will inaugurate an age of abundance, an age of general prosperity. So much, a lot of science fiction at that time envisages that advancement of technology, and of course you can see parallels with today as well. And the other element you see in science fiction of that time is because a lot of this was being written in the US, and of course the US's power on the global stage was growing, and this was around also the time when the idea that space was no longer inaccessible had begun to really take hold. The idea that in just a few years, which turned out to be true, human beings could actually go into space had taken root. And so the second element or second way in which science fiction is written at this time takes that idea, and of course, because science fiction is a genre that often explores the future, it looks to space exploration and exploration of other worlds in space as what will happen in the future. And because this style of writing is, of course, in the context of the growing global power of the US, you see in many ways it becoming hitched to the US imperial project, where writers often write about battles with alien species in the far depths of space, taking over, colonizing other worlds in space, pioneers who go into space, who are the advanced guard of humanity, and who use their pioneering status to then build colonies on other worlds. And if there are other presences of aliens, then there is a conflict, there is conquest. So in many ways, you can read this history of science fiction along with history of imperialism that's going on at that time. And that's, of course, a vision of a particularly violent and unequal future. But the really interesting thing about science fiction is that at all times in its history, there has been one dominant way or one dominant approach, but there's also been a counterculture, an underground part of it that is actually opposed to, and in many ways, in fundamental values, is on the other side of the spectrum. So around this time, of course, World War II ends. It ends with the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to destruction of human life to an unparalleled extent. And then begins the Cold War and the nuclear race between the US and the USSR. And science fiction writers respond to that. And so, if you read some of the old stories, which may look a little quaint now given the passage of time and the changed circumstances, there is a lot of fear about the possibilities of a nuclear war and the consequences of a nuclear winter. What would happen to the world if countries began to engage in a nuclear war? And you then have the emergence of post-apocalyptic dystopian science fiction, which envisions or envisages the end of a certain kind of a way of living, a certain kind of civilization, and what would human beings need to do in that case to survive. So you do have. So it's not that all of science fiction is in a certain way on the same side as imperialism or is optimistic about technology. At the same time, much like in Frankenstein, you have that internal tension between the liberatory promise of technology as well as the many problems it could bring. You have writing that celebrates technology, that talks about how the future is ultimately going to be defined by technology. On the other hand, you have writing stories, books that warn against that and that warn against a bleak future if technology is allowed to be in the hands of those who would use it for certain purposes. And so you have this tension continuing on. You have these different ways of understanding the future. There are optimistic visions, there are pessimistic visions, there are skeptical visions, there are more promising visions, but they all find a terrain in science fiction. And the reason for that is that, unlike literary fiction, science fiction gives you a much wider canvas to build a world. Because in literary fiction, in mainstream fiction, you have to take the world as you find it, and your characters populate that world, your characters interact within that world. In science fiction, the great thing is that you can change things about that world. You can and you have to, in fact, build a world that is both familiar, because if it's too unfamiliar, people will not respond to it, but also unfamiliar. You change one thing here, you change one thing there, and then you use that to reflect back upon the many aspects of the human condition. So, to give you an example of this kind of writing, one of my favorite short stories is by Isaac Asimov, the legendary science fiction writer, and it's called Nightfall. And the premise of Nightfall is that you have a planet, and this planet is surrounded by, it orbits 6 suns. So at any given time, so unlike just one sun, there are 6 suns in the sky. And so at any given time, there is at least one sun in the sky. And so there is no such thing as nightfall, and generations pass by. Nobody has ever experienced nightfall, nobody has ever experienced or has ever seen stars. Except once in 2000 years, when all the 6 suns are now on the other side of the planet, and then for the first time night falls. And one generation is then exposed to the night and to stars. And so Asimov asked the question that if something as basic and as fundamental to our existence as the night was not there, and then it came to us, how would we respond? And he brings out many of the deep-seated fears and insecurities that human beings have about the unfamiliar, about the stranger, about the other, and uses the science fictional terrain to just illuminate these fears. And that's why actually at a time at which the nuclear bomb has been dropped and the space race has begun, science fiction becomes the space in which writers can express their hopes and their fears for these different futures, and almost in certain senses draw lines from the present to different futures, that here is what might happen, or else this is what might happen, and what should human beings do to bring about one kind of future and avoid another kind of future. Of course, that is not to say that these novels are didactic or they're trying to preach. That's not at all the case. but they are trying to illumine certain things about the connections between the present and the future as mediated through technology, through human action, through space, many of these things that were really topical at that point of time. Now, one thing that I often hear from people when I talk to them about science fiction, so they say that we don't read science fiction, we don't find it very accessible to us. And then I ask them, so okay, what do you think science fiction means, or what do you think is science fiction? And then what often comes out is that for many people, science fiction is essentially going into space, in spaceships, stuff like Star Trek, stuff like exploring space, other worlds, and so on. Highly technical science that goes along with it, and so it is a bit inaccessible, a bit otherworldly. But that is actually not the case, and that changed drastically in 1960s after this era of exploring technology and exploring space through science. Because in the 1960s, as you know from history, there was an entire movement across the world in many countries that really questioned tradition. It really questioned many of the patterns of human behavior of communities that had been going on for generations. And it sought a certain kind of liberation in multiple spheres and multiple domains. And it sought a certain kind of freedom from those stifling social norms and social customs. And this was spread out across the world, many countries, from Mexico to Europe, in some cases, in some respects in India as well, and so on. And as always, science fiction responded to that changing society, to those popular movements. And so 1960s are commonly known as the new wave in science fiction, where writers began to respond to what was happening in society around them, not just these big questions around space and technology and the future, but other questions about society and how do we organize our lives. The future, not just in terms of where are we going and how are we getting there, but are there other ways to live in the future that are not bound to the way we live presently. And unsurprisingly, that also resulted in the opening up of the genre of science fiction to people who were not in it before. So until now, with a few exceptions, by and large, science fiction was written by mostly white men in the US, in England, and so on. But in the 60s, you have the entry of women writing science fiction. You have the entry of black science fiction writers. You have the entry of Eastern European Soviet science fiction writers coming on to the global scene. In many cases, fighting censorship and getting past censors to come into the global scene. And some of them are some of the most legendary names in science fiction. So one very famous example of this kind of science fictional writing, where the science in science fiction is not physical science but social science, is the writer called Ursula Le Guin, who wrote in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and onwards. And she wrote both fantasy and science fiction. If you've heard of her fantasy works, The Wizard of Earthsea is the famous novel. In science fiction, the two famous novels, The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed. And The Dispossessed is this really interesting novel where she imagines this satellite to a planet, and the main planet of the world called Uras is a world mostly like ours, where you have on the one hand many countries which are basically capitalist countries, and then you have other countries that resemble back then the Soviet Union state-imposed model of development. And it's a very familiar kind of place. It is basically a riff of Earth. But that planet, on the satellite of the planet, on the moon, some people have established a functioning anarchist society. So they have essentially put into practice the principles of anarchism, which is no hierarchies, no governing bodies, only coordination of activities. For example, every individual, no matter what other talents they have, must spend 1 in 10, part of their time on mining or garbage collection and so on. So there is this entire society she builds, which is neither capitalist nor state-imposed, whatever model you want to call the Soviet Union. but actually something very different. It's a society without governors, a society without rulers, and which is trying to make its own way. And notably, this is not a trouble-free society. So she does not give you, a happy, stable society, because obviously the question then becomes, if you don't have inequality, if you don't have money, if you don't have power, then what motivates human action? What would motivate human beings to then work, to innovate and to go forward? And there are answers there. I won't give them to you. It's a really good book. You should read it. But these are the conflicts. So even a society that has moved beyond and is perfectly equal, well, not perfectly, but is equal, and doesn't have many of the externally coercive instruments that our societies have, would still face problems. And she called that an ambiguous utopia. So it is, in a certain sense, utopian in that you have gotten rid of certain kinds of state violence, the state itself, but it's ambiguous. So it's not quite sure, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And ultimately, it's the readers who make up their minds on whether they want to live in a place like that or not. So she's not trying to really stuff something down your throat, but is showing you or illuminating for you various ways of living. And that, I think, fits in well with the shaping visions of society and the future. She also wrote another novel called The Left Hand of Darkness, which is again, is now very controversial. And in some ways it's not aged too well. And parts of it now will feel very dated, they'll feel quite out of date. But this was one of the first novels to really explore ideas of gender and sexuality in a science fictional context. So in The Planet, that is the center of the Left Hand of Darkness, basically the genders are not fixed. So every individual, every month ends up being either a man or a woman. They're both sex organs, and so they're basically androgynous. Right? So there's no fixed concept of gender on that planet, biologically speaking. This is not and then there's a person from our world where, of course, genders in many ways are socially are fixed. And when he arrives there, how he deals with a world in which, again, some of the very basic building blocks of our thought processes turn out to be contingent, is very, very interesting. And the whole novel explores, just what if our perceptions and our constructions of gender were not what they were, so there's something else. How would you deal with that? And of course, now, now social science and many fields of study have advanced to a point where we talk about these things as academic concepts. But this is way before. This was 1969 or 1972. This is far before this became part of the mainstream discourse. And so you can see how science fiction in that way can often be ahead of where the popular discussion is. It can lead the way. It can explore things or ideas because of its ability to change the world and build new worlds within the fiction. It can explore ideas that other kinds of fiction just can't because of this quality of science fiction. It can, and many years later, other fields of inquiry often catch up to it. Similarly, there was another writer called Joanna Russ who went even further than Le Guin and challenged ideas of gender and sex even more in her book. So there's a famous novel called The Female Man, and you can tell from the name that it was very controversial for its time, extremely polarizing. People really did not like it because it challenged their conceptions of sex and gender. But this was effectively what science fiction was doing at that time. It was partnering with, or it was in alliance with, in many ways, the social movements that were challenging established norms of the family, of the economy, of gender, and so on, and taking many of those challenges and taking them to their logical endpoint, and saying, look, this is where we go, this is where we can go. If the world was to look fundamentally different, here are examples of what that world might look like. And so this was, of course, in that sense, a time of these great world building projects that science fiction undertook, and these ideas of how we can live a little differently. So this was these 2 decades. The first black science fiction writer to achieve prominence was a man called Samuel Delany, and he wrote a very famous book called Babel 17, which took this idea that what if language built the world? So what if, so for example, if you didn't have a particular word for a concept, even the idea, the concept won't even exist. So how do you use language to achieve, a certain kind of freedom? You may have, read other kinds of novels in that broad domain. For example, there is one of the earliest science fiction novels of the last century, came out of Russia. So the Russian Revolution was 1917, and 3 years later, a man called Yevgeny Zamyatin wrote a novel called We. And in the society he is portraying in the novel We, there is no word for singular. There's only a word for the plural, the word we. And of course he is commenting on what is happening around him in the Soviet Union. One interesting historical fact: the first book that was ever banned in the Soviet Union was We. So if you're wondering, does science fiction have any impact? All these great ideas, what do they do? Well, yeah. So the first novel that the Soviets, when they became authoritarian after the revolution, the first novel they banned was a science fiction novel, because its critique of the regime was so on point that they couldn't have it published. This continued on for a long time. So in the 1960s and 70s, there were these two brothers, the Strugatsky brothers, in the Soviet Union, and they again wrote science fiction novels that really questioned the social model around them in many ways, questioned that, and their books were banned. So their books basically had to go hand to hand. It was called samizdat in Soviet Union. So when you're banned, it's essentially your books, or your chapter by chapter, they go hand to hand in like underground, and are passed on person to person. So your audience basically reads you chapter by chapter, delivering chapters by hand across the country, and that's how you actually are read. So there has been this uneasy relationship always between science fiction and its ability, by portraying alternative futures, to be able to critique the present in a way that is often perceived as dangerous by those in power. And you may have seen among the list of banned books that are there in the US recently, there are many science fiction novels that you find in those lists. Some of the most famous dystopic novels, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, A Brave New World, these are famous novels, have often been banned in various places, and you can see why, because they really they use science fiction's ability to build new worlds, to question the world we are in, and that is something that is always difficult for those in power to engage with. So you have the 70s ending with this kind of science fiction being written, and then you have the rise of the internet, in post 1980s, and that gives rise to a very fun style of science fiction writing called cyberpunk, which really goes into the nascent, growing cyber culture. And the most famous example is a book called Neuromancer, which some of you may have heard of, by William Gibson, and that's the book that coins the term cyberspace. So for a long time, actually, science fiction is not only about the future, it's not only about examining the present, but actually it's giving a language to what's happening around you. And so the word cyberspace actually owes its existence to a science fiction novel. So does the word robot, by the way. The word robot comes originally from a science fiction novel by Karel Čapek, an Eastern European writer, and he invented the word robot, which of course then now is a part of common language. And so you have a long time where where science fiction now is looking at the internet and is looking at its perils. Writers like Cory Doctorow, whose work is fantastic, often look at surveillance on the internet and how that plays a role in stifling us and what we can do about that. And so that's been the way the genre has developed over the years, and that's also how it continues to be today as well. Now, of course, in the present day, one of the sharpest crises that we face is the climate crisis, the climate change. And Amitabh Ghosh, 2 or 3 years ago actually, had a piece in The Guardian, maybe it was a little further back, where he lamented why are not writers engaging with climate change in fiction, because it's something which is so important, something which is so present. It's such an emergency in our time that why are not writers dealing with that? Well, one space where writers have dealt with it for a while now is science fiction, and climate change has long been really fundamental to science fiction writing. To give you an example, the major award for science fiction writing is the Arthur C. Clarke Award. It's every year it's awarded. It's a jury award, and you have six books shortlisted for the Clarke Award. And last year, out of the 6 finalists, 5 were in some way about climate change, and they were all very interesting novels. Perhaps the most interesting, I think, which is a good example of the kind of writing we're talking about, was a novel called Venomous Lumpsucker. Very funny name. The name Venomous Lumpsucker refers to a species, a fictional species, in that novel, and its premise is both fascinating and also bleak, because all of you, I'm sure, know of carbon credits. There's this idea that if you want to solve the climate crisis, what you do is don't stop polluting, and don't stop corporations from polluting. Don't stop that, because economic growth will suffer. But what you do is let corporations buy the right to pollute. So they will buy credits, carbon credits, and then you use that money, etc., to then take mitigation measures. So effectively, don't decrease or don't try and directly reduce pollution and save the planet, but make it a commodity, right? So that if you want to pollute, you trade in it, and you can also trade other things along with that. So Venomous Lumpsucker takes that idea and extends it to the extinction of species. So in that novel, you have something called extinction credits, where companies can buy the right to make species extinct. So if, say, you want to drill in an ocean, on the ocean floor, and there is a rare species of fish or other animal that is there, no longer are you banned from doing that, but you take credits, you pay money and into like a preservation fund, and then you acquire the right to basically drive a species to extinction. And so the entire premise of that novel is that if you were to extend the capitalist model from carbon credits to extinction credits, and then if that would become the dominant understanding of our relationship as human beings with the world of species, what would that look like? And that does 2 things. One, of course, is that it is a portrayal of a very dark and a very bleak world. The book, by the way, is very funny. So it's full of humor. It's full of wit and sarcasm. So there is it's not like a heavy book in that sense. It is a very funny book, and if you read it, you'll be laughing quite a lot. But it uses that humor to actually make what is a pretty dark point, which is that this is not going to be the way that we can actually preserve the planet, and this is not the world you want to live in. And so, in that sense, by extending the logic of carbon credits to something that looks a little absurd, because you can't really imagine at this point of time extinction credits as a concept. It's a little hard to think of things going that far, but it actually shows you how close it is to that possible future, and then also shows you the illogic or the arbitrariness of something like carbon credits. Just the idea that you can actually, pollution can be done if you pay for it, and there are ways to then get around that. Is there, and it's interesting because recently there was a book that came out by this scholar called Andreas Malm called Overshoot, where he talks about the ways in which actually many governments and national bodies have basically given up on the idea of restricting the rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And the logic that they're now using is of overshoot, which is that let things overshoot now, but we will, given the rate of advance of technology, we'll be able to have even better tech 20 years later, which will allow us to then bring down climate change. So they bet upon the future, basically mitigating climate change, and say, okay, there's no need to stick to 1.5 degrees. pollute as we want, the future will then take care of the present in certain ways. And in an overshoot then is a very interesting complementary read to Venomous Lumpsucker, because they're talking about the same things. They're talking about how a model that is premised on ceaseless growth and expansion, ultimately you can't tinker within that model to ultimately stave off disaster, right? And then what do you do? That question, of course, remains open. But this is how actually science fiction, modern science fiction, can really use this little change in the world, the little developments, to cast a very harsh light upon our present situation, whether it is climate change or whatever else. The other thing that really this genre explores right now is something which is beloved of people like Elon Musk and so on, which is terraforming. This idea that it's okay if Earth is polluted, if Earth is unlivable. What we'll do is we'll fly in spaceships. We'll go to the moon, we'll go to Mars, we'll go beyond. And what we'll do is we will use technology to terraform these planets, to change the terrain. We will bombard the planet with certain kinds of rays. We will ensure that we will accelerate the development of life-giving conditions on these planets. And so therefore human beings can now live on these planets without any problem. This is of course something that is quite seriously talked about by many people now. That okay, like let this Earth, this Earth is dying, it can't be saved, so we will colonize other planets and we will actually use terraforming as a way to do that. And modern day science fiction really takes a very critical look at that idea. That how can you actually do that, and the many perils that come with trying to shape ecosystems from scratch and trying to effectively play God by saying, okay, here is a barren planet, and I will use technology to basically create life on it. And of all the ways which that can go wrong and can go awry, is something that is dealt with by modern novels. So again, one of the finalists in that Clark Award shortlist is a novel called Pluto Shine, which takes the idea of terraforming Pluto. So again, it's in the near future, and there are attempts to terraform Pluto's surface, and it sounds absurd, but it uses that to comment on the absurdity of even imagining that this is a possible way around the climate crisis instead of dealing with it head on. So that is, I think, in broad ways, this brief historical journey through how science fiction has responded through its history to what's happening around it, and has tried to, in that way, talk about the future and deal with many of the preoccupations and the concerns that people have. So starting in the 1930s, techno-optimism, colonization, empire, in space, dominant themes, a counterculture that was about the nuclear holocaust, nuclear war, fears about that, caution about technology, going on into the new wave ideas of gender, sexuality, society, how do you shape the future in social ways, going on to cyberpunk, the internet, responding to that in different ways, and coming down to climate change now. So in each generation, what the zeitgeist is, what the worries and the concerns are, science fiction has responded, and it, as I said, its scope and its framing gives it this vantage point to be able to respond in the language of shaping society in the future in ways that other fields perhaps can't do in that way. Just to conclude, since I'm exactly at around 45 minutes, since in the other one of the fields mentioned is law, and that's what I do as a day job. One of the most interesting episodes of science fiction culture, where law plays a big part, is a very famous Star Trek episode called The Measure of Man, which if you haven't seen, I would recommend it. You can find it online. And this is an episode where there is the question of, is an artificial human being bearer of rights? That question is addressed. So there is artificial human being, artificial intelligence called Data, part of the crew member of in Star Trek, and then Data has to be decommissioned, has to be upgraded to and so effectively killed. And there is a courtroom scene where arguments are made that is this entity human enough to warrant saying no to their own destruction? Can you do that? And so in that way, the law is never far off from science fiction. And of course, you must have heard that there are all these issues of regulating AI. What does law say? What can law do? So science fiction has been again asking that question for a very long time, in different ways and in different forms, and will obviously continue to do so. So with that, I will cease with my opening remarks.